Hey everybody. Today's topic is the New Deal. So the New Deal is the name of President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, I'll call him FDR. That was the name of his plan to combat the Great Depression. So in the last video, we talked about the causes of the Great Depression. Here we're going to talk about what FDR did about those problems. So take a look at the maps of the presidential election from 1932 and 1936, and that'll give you a really good idea of how overwhelmingly popular FDR was. So when the Great Depression started, President Hoover was in office, and he didn't handle it well. He didn't know what to do. He was still kind of stuck in the mindset of laissez-faire economics. So he kept thinking like it'll work itself out. We don't want the government to get too involved. We just have to let the economy kind of go up and down like the cycles of nature. We shouldn't interfere. So as the depression got worse and worse, people were starting to get really angry because the president didn't seem too concerned about them. He didn't seem he wasn't willing to really do anything. So there was a really famous incident called the Bonus March while Hoover was president, and it was a bunch of World War I veterans that were demanding their pay. So they were supposed to get a bonus, but it wasn't due yet. So they demanded it early because they needed it. So thousands of World War I veterans and their families went to Washington, D.C. and just kind of camped out on the White House lawn until they were given a meeting with President Hoover, and they just wanted to get their bonuses early. They were there for about 10 weeks. Hoover refused to meet with them, and then he became convinced that it was like a communist plot or that they were going to try to destroy the government. So he had the military evacuate them by force using tear gas, and two people died, including one baby. So that was all over the news, and it was just sort of it marked the end of Hoover's support, really. FDR was running for president in 1932 against Hoover, who was running for a second term. And when FDR heard the news about the bonus march, he said, "Oh, I just won the presidency," and he was right. Hoover lost all credibility after that. So FDR came to power in February 1933. 1933 was the worst year of the Depression. It was the worst economy year in the entire history of America. So he took office at a very, very like dangerous time, and he knew that the country was seemingly falling apart. People were no longer obeying laws. They would go into grocery stores and steal food by gunpoint. They would go into banks and steal money at gunpoint. And there was so much resentment against the banks, especially, but also against any person who, was really wealthy. So the thing with the banks became really interesting. So we talked about the bank failures in the last video. A lot of people lost everything in the bank failures. So people had this real strong hatred towards the bank. And so there were several like well-known criminals that were bank robbers. So one of them is Pretty Boy Floyd. He was, and then there's Babyface Nelson. They all had these, nicknames, but they were known for robbing banks. And the thing was that most Americans didn't have anything against that. So they would go into banks and, get all the money from the bank. And it's almost like the customers in the bank would be cheering them on because they hated banks and they blamed them for their financial problems. So these were, it's kind of like the 1920s with Al Capone. They were criminals, but they were also sort of celebrities, kind of like a Robin Hood type, character. So when citizens aren't willing to like enforce the law, that's a real good sign that like law and order is just completely falling apart. Other examples would be people in big cities like New York City would get evicted from their apartments because they couldn't pay their rent. And the apartment owner would come in and just take all of their stuff out of their apartment and bring it all to the street below, just put it on the street. And what people did in response to that, just random people they took everything back into the apartment, basically making the stance that, they're not leaving, and all these people support them. They're helping them bring their stuff back. They're not going to leave the apartment. Same thing with like utilities. If someone's gas got cut off because they couldn't pay, people figured out how to redo the gas. I don't really know exactly what that means, but they would figure out how to get the gas going for those people who had had their gas cut off. Same with electricity. And a lot of these people who did these things were members of the Communist Party. And, they really thought communism was a better deal. And so they wanted to do kind of whatever they had to do to discredit the American government. But what they were doing was widely supported by the public because of so much animosity and desperation. People who would go into grocery stores and steal things, the juries wouldn't convict them. Like they would get arrested sometimes, and the juries would people who had to decide if they were guilty or not most often said not guilty. So people were stealing food, and then the court was just letting them off because the jurors actually agreed with them. They actually thought that, yeah, if you have to do that to keep your family alive, yeah, do it. So law and order was just falling apart. Many people were talking about revolution. So 1933 is considered the year that the US got closest to having a revolution. 1933 and 1968 are sort of tied for that. But in 33, people thought, yeah, the country's not going to make it through this. So FDR really changed all that. There's Other than Lincoln, there's no president who has come into a situation so dire and urgent on their first day in office. But FDR immediately, he knew that he had to immediately restore people's faith in the government and in capitalism because people were really wanting to kill those things. So it was like an immediate action to get people to trust the system again. And the way that he did that was he used radio. He was the first president to use the radio to communicate with the public. He did this magnificently. He did such a good job. He was perfect for somebody to be speaking on the radio to the citizens of the country. And his first address to the country on the radio was about the banks. So his addresses on the radio were known as fireside chats, and it kind of really made people feel like he was just talking to them. So people at home would have their radios on and they'd listen to the president. And he would say things like, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that started to give people hope. He had a great voice. He was great at speaking to people. And so his mannerisms and his voice provided some comfort to people that maybe things can get better. He also, like I mentioned, the first radio address was about the bank failures, and he got on the radio and told the public, our banks failed you, and we understand that this is not your fault. The bank system failed, but we need to work together to fix it. So he asked everybody, as a sign of your confidence in our ability to get past this oppression, I'm asking you all to go back to the banks tomorrow and put your money back in the banks, because anyone who still had money or who didn't lose their money when the banks failed, they withdrew their money, of course, if they got to it before their banks failed. So people had their money just cash at home, and he asked them to trust the banks. And the next day after that radio address, more people deposited money in the banks than withdrew. So he said that that's what we need to do in order to fix this. And then he called an 8-day bank holiday, which meant that the banks were going to be closed for 8 days. And he's telling the American public this. And during those 8 days, new currency will be printed and sent to local banks. And so you can be assured that your money will be safe. One of Roosevelt's advisors said, in those 8 days, Roosevelt saved capitalism. And that may be true. I mean, we don't know. So as soon as the first week went by, the bank holiday was over, FDR started putting these plans into action like very, very quickly. He knew that he didn't have much time. People were getting to the verge of like revolution. He knew he had to do something quickly to provide aid to people, and also just like confidence in the system, the American system. So he started passing all this legislation. Actually, Congress passed the legislation, but he asked Congress to, and He got more legislation passed through Congress than any other president in American history. Congress listened to him. He was widely admired, as you can see by the 1932 electoral map. Also, he was elected 4 times as president. So we'll talk more about that in the next, when we get to World War II. But he did things very quickly. So he established all these programs that are known as New Deal programs, and they were all based on 4 ideas. The first one was we have to protect capitalism. So in other countries that were experiencing economic crisis, which was a lot, most of them, most countries that were industrialized were feeling the effects of the economic depression. And in some of those countries, people turned to very radical political leaders and beliefs. So in Germany, of course, the economic crisis led to the rise of Hitler. In Italy, it led to the rise of their dictator, Mussolini. France almost became communist. They had a communist revolution. They were on the verge of communism. Turkey and Greece, also the United States helped them to avoid communism. But what was going on in the world was that democratically elected capitalist governments were falling apart. People didn't have trust in them anymore. And if it weren't for Roosevelt coming in at the right place and the right time, I don't know for sure if the United States would still be a capitalist democratic country, or if it would even exist at all. We don't even know that for sure. We can look at other countries and say, yeah, like, look what happened here. That could have happened here because it happened in so many other places. So personally, I think Roosevelt's effectiveness kept the country from falling apart. So again, sorry, 4 ideas shaped by New Deal policy: protect capitalism. So this one became really important because as Roosevelt and Congress began to take more control over the economy, a lot of people were saying that's communism or that's socialism. The government can't control the economy. And Roosevelt would, and his supporters would reply and say, he's trying to protect capitalism. And in order to protect capitalism, you can't let capitalism fail. And we're letting it fail right now because we're not fixing the mistakes that capitalism made. So he was basically convincing people that, we don't need to switch to communism. We just need to fix capitalism. And the way we would do that was restoring people's faith in it. And restoring people's faith in it requires it to be fixed. Like, people had to be employed again and able to buy things before they would trust capitalism again. So everything was about protecting capitalism. The second idea shaped by New Deal policy was fix underconsumption. Underconsumption means that factories and farms are producing too much stuff. And but as a result of there being too much stuff, it's just not selling. And so when things don't sell, you lower your prices. And then your competitor lowers their prices. We talked about this with the causes of the Great Depression video, but basically the government had to restore the balance between supply and demand, because when supply is like up here and demand is like right here, that's you're asking for failure, because in order to sell all this stuff, you're gradually bringing the price down, which requires labor cuts, people getting laid off from their job, getting lower wages, and then that whole cycle begins that we talked about in the causes of the Great Depression. All right, the third idea of the New Deal was that corporations can't be more powerful than the government. The government has to be at least as powerful as corporations. So this was a big change from the laissez-faire attitude of the 1920s and previous. So last one is government should somewhat moderate the imbalance of wealth. So the income tax was put into place in 1916, and partly it was designed to sort of limited effort to redistribute wealth. So taking a little bit from the really rich and using that to fund the government. We're not yet at the point where people were being helped by that money that comes with FDR, actually. But for the 1920s, there was just such a vastly unequal distribution of wealth. There were not enough people who could afford to buy all the new things. So because of this is why we have a minimum wage. So I just want you to put those two things together. Government needs to make sure that it moderates the imbalance of wealth. and it needs to make sure that under under consumption is not an issue. And the way you do that is by making sure that people have money to buy stuff and keeping the prices from dropping, like keeping the prices high helps do that. So these were all about basically government involvement in the economy. And I think most of us would agree that minimum wage is a good thing, that child labor should be regulated, unemployment benefits should be offered, just so many things. So one of the ways in which Roosevelt wanted to combat unemployment is by reducing the labor force. So this is when child labor laws passed. There had been movements to pass them for, decades, but this is when it passed because the argument was if less children are working in factories, there'll be more jobs for adults who actually need to provide for the family. So child labor was limited, restricted, really. And the Disability Social Security Act passed in 1935, and there were two reasons for that one as well. One, we need to make sure that old people have money so that they can continue to be consumers. Two, we need to address unemployment, and the one way to do that was encouraging people to retire when they meet the retirement age, which it's 65 now. I don't know if it was 65 back then, but basically, like if you can get those people to leave their jobs because they know they'll have some sort of income, then you're creating jobs for others. Similarly, the 40-hour work week was passed, another thing that people had wanted to pass forever, but the government would never support it. But now people supported it because if you limit someone's working hours, then there's more hours for other people. So less people are unemployed if you do that. These were all very important New Deal acts that took place throughout the 1930s: child labor restriction, Social Security, minimum wage, 40-hour work week. Actually, it was 44 hours at the time, but you get the point. The government's limiting the amount of time people can work. So those were very effective, and we still use those things, and we still have all those restrictions and benefits provided to workers. One of the best things about FDR, in my opinion, was his wife. Eleanor Roosevelt was amazing. She's actually like my hero, really. But Roosevelt, FDR, was in a wheelchair because he had polio, and he didn't want anyone to know that he couldn't walk. So he would have, whenever he was walking up to give a speech, he would have one person on either side of him, and he would be gripping onto them, and they would kind of help him make it look like he's walking. But he actually was in a wheelchair. And whenever he gave speeches, a lot of times he did it from a convertible, like a car with the top down. And the reason he did that is because there was like a metal bar put in there that he could hold on to while he was standing. And Americans never thought that was weird because the car was sort of a symbol of prosperity and American manufacturing power. So they just thought it was like symbolic in some way. But because he was paralyzed and did not want the public to know, his wife, Eleanor, took over a lot of the things that a president would normally do, such as going around the country talking to people, giving little speeches in small towns, finding out how things are working in different industries and different parts of the country. So Roosevelt asked Eleanor to be his eyes and ears. So she began to travel all over. And as she was doing that, she just realized that there's so many things that need to be addressed. And one of those things that she saw that really is a problem was racism and racial violence. So she became a very strong advocate for the civil rights movement, and much more a strong advocate, much more than her husband. So FDR himself was really worried about taking a strong stand against racism because he felt like he needed the support of Southern Democrats. But Eleanor didn't have to worry about that. And her husband, FDR, agreed with what she was doing and what she was saying. But it was almost like he was like, I can't say this myself or I'll lose support, but you can say it and you should say it because I think we do need to address lynchings and segregation and that kind of thing. So Eleanor took that role. She worked very closely with a lot of different civil rights organizations, and they had a lot of trust in her. They really respected her. She also worked with human rights advocates and women's rights advocates. Like, she was just amazing. There was a headline of a newspaper sometime in the 1930s, and the headline said, Eleanor Roosevelt spends night at White House. So that was a big deal. Like, she actually spent the night at the White House and she wasn't around traveling. So that's how much she was out being his eyes and ears. So we'll talk about her more when we look at World War II, because she was the one that was constantly saying, we've got to let more Jewish refugees in. We've got to address racial violence. We have to do these things. So she kind of had the freedom to speak a little bit more freely. And she became very, very well respected by the American people. After FDR died in 1945, there was a Universal Committee on Human Rights that was beginning, they were forming, and the first thing that they wanted to do was draft a Declaration of Universal Human Rights. And they had one person from every major country come and work on this, and she was the one who represented the United States. So very well respected. So there's a lot of New Deal acts, and I'll just go through some of them very quickly. Definitely not all, but one of them. Sorry. The point of many of these New Deal acts was two. They wanted to kind of fix two problems at once. One, they wanted to make it where people could buy stuff, and two, they wanted to solve unemployment. So it's all about sort of solving the problem of unemployment by making sure people can buy stuff. So the FDIC was established, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and that basically insures the money that you put in banks. It is an insurance, sort of a promise by the federal government to make sure that you don't lose your money if a bank fails. So really important. The Federal Housing Authority was established. And, again, two purposes. One, you're creating jobs by allowing people to buy. The Federal Housing Authority gave loans to first-time home buyers, and it let them buy a house with a very low down payment. So that allowed more people to be homeowners. And that was part of the purpose of it. But the other purpose was to stimulate economic growth. And one of the best ways to do that is with the housing industry. So when there's a strong demand for houses, it puts a lot of people to work. I mean, all the people who build the houses, the mortgage lenders, the real estate brokers, so many people. So just by contributing to help people buy their first home, the economy was boosted by that because more people were buying homes, and that puts more people to work. We still have the Federal Housing Authority. It has some kind of a bit of a negative history if you look at it, throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. The Federal Housing Authority helped to enforce residential segregation. They wouldn't give loans to African Americans who were trying to buy houses in white neighborhoods. Just throwing that out there. We'll talk about that more later. But Roosevelt and Congress also created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. And what this did was it provided direct aid. It's kind of like our current welfare system. People could apply to just get money. Most of the New Deal acts weren't like that. Most of them were about creating jobs. But this one was sort of a direct, immediate source of some sort of, income for many, many families. The CCC was established. It was the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what this did was the federal government paid young men, so men between the ages of 18 and 25, they could work for the government, and they would do projects like build bridges. They would build trails in state parks. They built cabins and other things in state parks. And if you go to a lot of state parks today, you'll see a sign somewhere that says this trail or this cabin was built by the CCC. So that was pretty effective. It gave young men some income, and a lot of times they sent most of that income back home to their family. Very similar to this was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. It's similar in a sense. I think the WPA was one of the best New Deal acts. So what this did was is the federal government giving jobs to people in the arts. So they had the Federal Writers Project, the Federal Theaters Project, the Federal Art Project, Federal Photography Project. And so people would get paid by the government to take part in these projects. And what they did was really important. The Federal Writers Project sent a lot of writers to the Deep South to interview former slaves. They knew that, like, in about 10 years, there probably wouldn't be any former slaves left. So the government was like, we need to get their story down. We need to find out, all that we can from them because they're not going to be here forever. And a lot of them couldn't read or write because enslaved people were not allowed to learn to read or write. So they couldn't really they couldn't write their own story. So the Federal Writers Project went to the South and interviewed them, and it gives us so much really good information about what it was like to actually be enslaved. The Federal Theaters Project employed actors to go around the country and put on plays. The Federal Photography Project employed photographers, and they were given the instructions to, like, capture reality, capture what people are going through. We're not trying to make like artsy photographs. We're trying to document reality. So it was more of a documentary approach. And if you look up Great Depression photographs, you'll see a ton in there, and they're all in the public domain because they're owned by the government. So that means, like, you could use one for free in a movie or something. The Federal Music Project focused on the Deep South as well. Musicologists went to the Mississippi Delta area and recorded some of the earliest music. The earliest blues that we have in existence was recorded by the Federal Music Project. And those tapes, if you're interested, those recordings are in the Al Gore Center for Popular Music and at MTSU's campus in the library. So you can go listen to them. So that's the WPA. I'm sorry, there's so many things I'm trying to figure out what's what's leave out because I could be here forever, but I won't, so don't worry. Okay, one of the very controversial acts was the AAA, and it stood for Agricultural Adjustment Act. And this one was really hard for people to understand because this act called for a reduction in the food supply. So it was the same issue, overproduction in food. So they were producing too much food, and the South was producing too much cotton. Because if you're a cotton farmer in the South and that's all you can do, and the prices of cotton start dropping, what would be the most beneficial would be for you to stop producing cotton so that the prices will go back up because demand will increase and supply will decrease. So, but no one would ever do that because, like, if you rely on the sale of cotton to feed your family, you're not going to produce less cotton in order to make the cotton price rise. You're going to do what you have to do to feed your family, which is produce more cotton. So the AAA was put into place to stop this pattern of farmers just producing too much stuff because they couldn't make enough money off of the stuff. So the AAA required landowners such as what's it called? Sharecroppers. So landowners who owned a bunch of land, ever since the days of slavery ended, what they tended to do was give people a certain amount of that land to live on, and in exchange, those people will grow crops that the landowner can sell. So it's almost like you pay your rent by growing crops. But because too many crops were being grown, the federal government said, hey, instead of growing crops on 100 acres of land, we're going to put half of it in. Half of it will be blocked off. That half will not be used. So that'll in turn, create less land to grow crops, which will reduce the limit of crops, which will make the price of them go up. So as these big landowners were being paid to produce less, so they're being paid to not grow food on all their land, just half of it. They didn't need as many sharecroppers because the sharecroppers, their only job was to grow food. So they no longer needed them. So it kind of turned out where sharecroppers were kicked off the land. But the bigger issue with the AAA was that people in America were starving and the government is paying farmers and industry to produce less food. People just couldn't understand that. So there were like at the time there was way too much milk in existence and way too many pigs apparently. So the AAA project called for people to destroy the milk and the eggs. So they dumped out about 6 billion gallons of milk and estimated several million pigs that were slaughtered and not used for food. So the public just couldn't understand this. They were like, if we have extra food, why don't you give it to us? We are starving. Um, when you tell someone like that, oh, we're trying to, restore the balance between supply and demand, they don't care. They just want to feed their children. So people would see the destruction of crops and they just got really angry. I can imagine. But the purpose of it made sense. It's just that when you're hungry, you're not going to think about economic philosophy. You just want to have something to eat. So that became very controversial for people to know that the government was actually destroying food and restricting the amount of food that could be grown. It was great for the farmers because they were now getting paid to produce less. I hope that makes sense. Other important acts were, like I mentioned, Social Security that passed in 1935, and we still have that today. When you retire from your job, you will get a certain amount of money that will help you live the rest of your life without having to get employment. So very popular, but also very controversial because it took money out of people's paychecks. And Americans, we don't like the government to take money out of our paychecks. It just seemed to many people that it was too much government power. But we still have it today. But many people at the time were like, that's communism. The government's actually taking money from us without our consent. So it was very controversial. But that money that the government took from us and continues to take from us, in theory, we should get that back when we retire. So, but at the time, people just didn't understand it. So the AAA and the Social Security Act were both very controversial. Another one was the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. This is where we get our electricity if you're in Nashville. It provided electricity to portions of 7 states. And it was important because the rest of the country had electricity. The sort of the Appalachian mountain areas, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, West Virginia, those areas have been typically poor and kind of very kind of separate in a way from the rest of the country. Not a lot of awareness maybe of things going on in the rest of the country, a little bit more isolated, I should say. So they were the ones who didn't have electricity, and the TVA was put into place to provide electricity for those areas and also to provide employment. But it was very controversial because it was ownership of a company by the government. The government owns TVA. So many people were like, that's communism. And, it actually is. But people wanted electricity and people wanted jobs. So most people were in favor of it. The National Labor Relations Board was established. And basically, if you are a worker and you didn't get paid what you were told you'd get paid, if they weren't paying you minimum wage or allowing breaks every 4 hours, you could contact the National Labor Relations Board, and they would look into it. So it was just an office where they provided assurance that people are getting what they are supposed to from their employers, whether that's disability pay or minimum wage payment. The National Labor Relations Board, would have their back. So I'll just mention one more act. I'm trying to decide which one because I'm looking at my list. There's so many. The one I talked about earlier that restricted child labor and created the minimum wage, that was known as the Wagner Act. It also provided protection for labor unions, so you couldn't be fired from your job if you went on strike. So this was good for labor unions because for a long time that was a really big problem for them. All right, so there's lots more acts, but we'll kind of leave it at that for the acts. But couple more things that are really important about the New Deal. Number one, the New Deal changed the political parties and pretty much almost completely. The South ever since 1824, the South was always Democratic. They always voted Democrat. They fought the South. The Democratic Party of the South was the party that seceded to start the Civil War in 1860. And the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. It started as a party whose main goal was to restrict the spread of slavery. So the South had remained a Democratic region ever since 1824 up until the Great Depression. No, I mean, it still did remain Democratic after the Great Depression, but what was new was that the North began to vote Democratic as well. And you can see from the two maps of presidential election in 1932 and 36, you can see that almost every state except for 4 voted for the Democratic candidate in 1932, and every state except 2 voted for the Democratic candidate in 1936. So this was the first time that the North and big cities were voting for the Democratic Party. So it really helped to shift the parties. The South was no longer sort of just the only party that supported the Democratic candidate, or the only region that supported the Democratic Party. It was a kind of spread throughout the country now after Roosevelt's first term. The New Deal and FDR also changed the voting patterns of African Americans. They had never voted Democratic before, and it's obvious why. The Democratic Party supported slavery, and then after the Civil War, the Democratic Party supported segregation, lynching, all that stuff. So it was never the party of African Americans until the Great Depression. Most African Americans voted for FDR in 32, and then almost all in 36. Of course, Southern African Americans couldn't vote, so we're really talking about Northern Blacks who were kind of reshaping the Democratic Party. And if you want the support of someone, you have to appeal to their needs and their interests. So now members of the Democratic Party who were running for office in the North, they knew that they could finally get some support from Northerners, especially African Americans. And in order to really get that support, they had to offer them something like, we're going to improve your schools, or we're going to fight for a federal anti-lynching bill or something. So they're kind of reaching out to try to get the support of African Americans, which was great for African Americans. It gave them a little bit of like bargaining power. Like, yeah, we'll vote for you if you do such and such. So another thing was that more people voted for president. Ever since like the Civil War era, people had been more concerned with local government, like voting for governors and mayors. And this was the first time that the president really became the most important in people's eyes. So partly this goes along with the fact that FDR made the role of the presidency more important. He personally asked Congress to pass all these bills, and most of the time they did it. He was sort of the face and the voice of the nation, of the government, so that the role of the president and the role of the federal government became much more important and visible in people's daily lives. Most of them really didn't care who was president before this. Let's see. So Roosevelt didn't do a lot for the civil rights movement FDR, he didn't do a lot, especially during the Great Depression. He supported most aspects of it. He supported what Eleanor was doing, but he was too timid, and he didn't want to lose support of the South. But he did a couple of things, limited things, to help to try to like start combating racism. So one of the things he did was he appointed the first Black federal judge. And this was important because ever since the beginning of America, there had been no federal judge who was African American. So yeah, it was important. The other thing he did was he formed a committee, and that committee's job was to go into the Deep South and document all the sort of things that they find, like document lynchings, talk to people, find out about what terrorist groups like the KKK were doing, just kind of find out what's going on. And this study took a long time. And the committee, when they finally had the results ready, FDR had already died, and the new president, Truman, was in power. And this report from that committee had a lot of impact on Truman. So this became important later on. But it's fair to say that FDR didn't do a lot to address racism. He kept saying, now is not the time. We're in the middle of a horrible depression, and we need to focus on that first. And he thought that he would get the chance to focus on racism, but he never did, because as soon as the depression ended, we went into World War II, and then it was still not the right time, to do major things like desegregate the military. So he kept saying, like, we have to wait for the right time, which never came for him. So, uh, looking at the effectiveness of the New Deal, um, it helped a lot. Like, it helped stabilize the economy, but it didn't end the depression. You can see if you look at unemployment rates throughout the 1930s, it's really high at 1932. And then 1933 comes in, Roosevelt gets in office, and it starts to go down and starts to go down. But at the end of 1939, it was still, we were still in a depression. It just wasn't as bad. So the New Deal didn't end it, but it certainly helped prevent the country from falling apart, which would have probably happened without it. What ended the Depression was World War II. In 1939, the war started. I mean, it's really hard to say when it started because there's so many different conflicts going on. But 1939 was when the US got involved, not yet in the war, but involved in producing weapons for France and England and their allies. So the US at first was like, we want to stay out of this, but we could make a lot of money off of producing all this stuff that the warring countries need. So it did. I mean, that was very effective. The US got out of the Depression by 1941 because production really started to ramp up after 1939, because we were now producing supplies for the Allies. So that's really what ended the Depression. But the New Deal was effective. So, last thing I want to mention is that this depression became global, and I would speculate that World War II would not have happened without the Depression. The Depression created instability throughout the world. So, Japan was feeling it really hard, and it led to the rise of like a very militaristic kind of political system. The military took control. They had more power than the government. They weren't listening to the government. And this is when they started to do some really awful things, really awful. It was never the Japanese people, it was the military. It was like the military was out of control. There was no authority who could handle what they were doing. And this was all a result of people like suffering and chaos, like economic devastation. They want somebody to fix it. So if the military is saying, hey, if we go in and conquer China, we can fix our problems, people are going to be like, yeah, let's do that. So Japan became very imperialistic and started to try to take over China and other parts of East Asia. And of course, we know what happened in Germany because of the Depression. Hitler used the Depression as a way to prepare for war. So during their Depression, they started preparing for war, and that helped them get out of their depression. But now they had to like go to war because they had produced all this stuff. So the economy was very connected to war. The United States economy was almost built on war production. So that's why we got out of the depression so quickly once the war started. Yeah, so just review the Dawes Plan and spend a little bit of time like reviewing the Treaty of Versailles, the sequence of events from the Treaty of Versailles to the Great Depression and the Dawes Plan to World War II. It all kind of, it's hard to imagine one without the other. All right, I'm just going to tell you my bias. I think FDR was the best president in American history. That's my bias that I want to put out there because it's important for y'all to know, things like that, because you can sort of make the come to the realization that maybe others wouldn't view the New Deal or FDR that way, the same way as I do. So I'm a big supporter. But we'll leave it there, and thanks for watching. Have a good day.